Hello and welcome to my channel today. I'm bringing you a story about a girl named Reina. But this Reina is a disaster, a cunning troublemaker, a devil who gave her family endless headaches. The story, or rather the crime, occurred in 2009. But let's go back to events before that date. When Reina was 18 years old, there wasn't a single problem or trouble that she didn't cause. She would skip school, stay out late, go out with friends, boys and girls, and her family, of course, would catch her, reprimand her, and even beat her. But Reina didn't learn. She was rebellious, shameless, a girl with no boundaries. We call such girls auba, a term for reckless or disobedient girls. Despite all this, she possessed the kind of beauty any young man would dream of. Tall, well-built, and attractive. But her character? Absolutely terrible. Her family had had enough. After trying everything, they decided to accept the first marriage proposal that came her way, just to get rid of her. And indeed, one day, a young man named Hamid proposed to her. They inquired about Hamid, only to find out that he was a troublemaker himself, with a history of issues and even a criminal record. But her family said, he's perfect for her. They figured that someone like Hamid could handle Reina, discipline her, and make her walk a straight line. A decent man wouldn't last 2 days with her before divorcing her. So, when Reina agreed, they immediately arranged the marriage and sent her off to live with Hamid in the heart of Damascus. Life went on. Hamid wasn't exactly stable. He'd find a job one day and be unemployed for 10. He relied on his family to support him. At times, he resorted to stealing or mugging people to get by. 2 or 3 years passed. That's when Hamid started noticing something. Reina hadn't gotten pregnant yet. Like many young men, he faced societal pressure. People around him would ask, "Still no children? What's wrong? Are you even a man?" His mother would taunt him, saying things like, "Are you incapable?" or "What's your issue?" The constant questioning got to him, and he started pressing Reina about it. She told him, "It's not in my hands, and you know that." But he insisted they visit a doctor to check if something was wrong. After medical tests, it turned out that Reina was the one with fertility issues. While she wasn't completely infertile, she had problems that required treatments and medications to help her conceive. Given Hamid's financial situation, barely scraping by, he couldn't afford expensive medical treatments. They decided to leave it up to fate, hoping that with time, Reina might conceive naturally. As years went by, 4, 5 years into their marriage, their relationship became increasingly toxic. They would argue, fight, insult, and even physically harm each other. But somehow, they carried on. Toward the end, Hamid became more fixated on the idea of having children. It reached the point where he started considering marrying another woman to fulfill his desire for a child. Reina felt threatened by this. She knew her family had long since abandoned her, severing all ties. If Hamid divorced her, she had nowhere to go. No one would hire her, and she wouldn't be able to sustain herself. Without Hamid, she'd end up homeless and starving. So when Hamid's family began pressuring him to marry someone else, a cousin or another woman, Reina started plotting. One day, she told Hamid, "Congratulations." He asked, "For what?" She replied, "I'm pregnant." He was overjoyed and asked how she knew. She explained that she had taken a home pregnancy test and noticed the signs herself. She claimed to be in the early stages of pregnancy, perhaps the 1st or 2nd month. Hamid's excitement was unmatched. He called his family and friends, even his troublemaking buddies, to share the news. Everyone congratulated him, teasing him about finally becoming a father. This news made him forget about marrying a second wife entirely. But Reina knew she was living on borrowed time. She had to come up with a solution to cover her lie. For the 1st month, the 2nd, and even the 3rd, Hamid was elated, proudly telling everyone about his soon-to-arrive child. Then, one day, law enforcement showed up at their house. They knocked loudly, demanding to see Hamid. Reina opened the door and asked, "What's going on?" They pushed past her, rushed in, and arrested Hamid. It turned out that Hamid had been accused of drug trafficking. Although no drugs were found on him, authorities claimed they had reliable sources linking him to a drug distribution network. Hamid was stunned. He insisted, "I do everything, stealing, fighting, but I don't touch drugs." Despite his protests, he was taken to jail to await trial. Meanwhile, Reina was left to deal with the aftermath, wondering how much deeper she could sink into this mess. Days passed, and Reina didn't know what to do. The stress consumed her, and she became increasingly isolated, but she hadn't forgotten about her lie, her supposed pregnancy. She realized she had to fake a miscarriage to get herself out of the situation. One night, while visiting Hamid in prison, she told him, "Hamid, I have bad news." He asked, "What happened?" She said, "I lost the baby." Hamid was devastated and asked how it happened. She claimed that the stress of his arrest had caused her to miscarry. Hamid, already overwhelmed by his legal troubles, believed her without questioning too much. He consoled her and assured her that everything would be fine once he was released. However, Reina's problems didn't end there. With Hamid in jail, she had no source of income. She begged his family for help, but they turned their backs on her, blaming her for Hamid's troubles. With no one to turn to, she started looking for other ways to survive. Around this time, she met a man named Khaled. Khaled was in his early 30s, charming and wealthy. He quickly took an interest in Reina and began courting her. She saw Khaled as her way out of the mess she was in, and before long, she started an affair with him. Reina didn't waste time. She convinced Khaled that Hamid had abandoned her and that she was in desperate need of support. Khaled, blinded by her beauty and charm, believed her and started providing for her financially. He rented her an apartment and even gave her money for daily expenses. But Reina's double life didn't last long. One day, Hamid's cousin spotted her with Khaled at a cafe. He immediately informed Hamid's family, who were furious. They confronted Reina, but she denied everything, claiming Khaled was just a friend helping her during tough times. However, the family didn't buy her story. They cut off all ties with her and warned Hamid about her betrayal during their next prison visit. Hamid was enraged. Despite his flaws, he had remained loyal to Reina and couldn't believe she would cheat on him. Reina, sensing that her lies were unraveling, decided to disappear. She packed her belongings, took all the money Khaled had given her, and left the apartment without telling anyone where she was going. For a while, Reina lived a quiet life, hopping from one place to another to avoid being found. But trouble seemed to follow her wherever she went. Eventually, Khaled discovered her deception and cut her off completely. Left with nothing, Reina resorted to her old ways, manipulating and deceiving people to survive. As for Hamid, he was eventually released from prison after the charges against him were dropped due to lack of evidence. But his life was never the same. He returned to his family, who urged him to forget about Reina and move on. Years later, Reina's story became a cautionary tale in her neighborhood. People spoke of her beauty and her downfall, a reminder that deceit and betrayal always come at a cost. Reina reached out to her husband through one of her friends, convincing her to report him to one of the drug enforcement officers she knew. She informed the officer that he was involved in drug trafficking and dealing. As a favor to her friend, the officer staged a raid on the husband's home. Although no drugs were found, they framed him with fabricated charges. Reina's intention behind this was to buy herself some time to deal with the problem she was in. She reasoned that it wouldn't matter if her husband went to jail for assault, theft, or other charges, as there weren't any actual drugs involved. She believed he'd only serve a few months and then get out. During this time, she planned to align her lies with society's expectations, especially as her husband and his family awaited the birth of her baby. She feared that by the 5th or 6th month of her supposed pregnancy, the truth would come out if she didn't show any signs of it. Thus, she orchestrated his imprisonment. Her husband, clueless about the setup, was devastated, swearing by his innocence in court. As court proceedings dragged on, taking 6 to 7 months to reach a verdict, Reina kept in touch with him while he was in jail. She would call or visit him, telling him that the baby was due soon. She even said she would stay with a friend to avoid her estranged family. Her husband, unaware of her deceit, told her to take care of herself and stay in touch. In the final months of his imprisonment, Reina gave birth at her friend's place and informed him that they had a baby boy. He was overjoyed, even though he was in jail. A month later, she called him, crying, saying her friend and her friend's husband were forcing her into prostitution. She claimed they had taken her child as leverage and threatened to harm him if she resisted. Her husband, in disbelief, told her to escape, leaving the baby with them, and assured her he would retrieve the child after getting out of jail. A month and a half later, Reina called her husband and said she managed to escape and leave her baby behind. He reassured her, promising to get their baby once he was released. By the end of the month, her husband was released on a suspended sentence. Meanwhile, Reina went to a park called Zahra Park in Damascus, where she came across a couple, a doctor and her engineer husband, with their newborn child. Seeing them happy, Reina approached them, pretending to be heartbroken and weeping, claiming that her ex-husband had separated her from her children. She said the couple's baby reminded her of her youngest child, making the doctor sympathetic toward her. The doctor consoled her, allowing Reina to hold her baby. Reina then introduced herself as a wealthy woman with a luxurious lifestyle, but lamented the loss of her children to her cruel ex-husband. Feeling pity for her, the doctor invited Reina over to their home for lunch. Reina started visiting the doctor and her husband frequently, bringing gifts and becoming close friends with the couple. The doctor's husband, relieved that his wife now had company while he was at work, welcomed Reina into their lives. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, Reina spent significant time with the doctor and her baby, growing attached to the child and making the couple trust her completely. Once her husband was released, Reina picked him up and took him to their apartment. She told him about the baby and her plan. Her husband, still believing her lies, vowed to confront the so-called friend and her husband who had taken their baby. Reina assured him they would deal with the situation together. The important thing is, Reina approaches them. As soon as the woman saw her with her child, she started crying. She began to act broken, as if she were in a very bad state. The woman asked her, "Is everything okay? What happened?" She replied, "No, it's just that I remember my children whom my ex-husband kept away from me. And when I saw your son, he looked just like one of my children." She began to cry. The woman hugged her and said, "Come here, rest. Sit next to me. Life always has problems, but one day, hopefully, you'll meet your children." This poor woman said, "God bless you. Could I hold your son for a while?" The woman agreed. "Of course." And she took the child in her arms, holding him close and saying, "When I first saw your son, I remembered my own child. He resembled my son and my other children too, but this one, he looks just like my younger son." She then started to get to know her, asking, "What's your name?" The woman replied, "My name is Name, and I'm a doctor. And this is my husband, Name, an engineer working in location." And they continued talking. Reina told her, "My situation is good, I live in a luxurious apartment and everything is excellent. But I'm deprived of my children, and my ex-husband is a vile person." The doctor and her husband sympathized with her, and they felt bad for her. They said, "Why don't you come over for lunch at our house?" "We're going there now." Reina said, "It's no trouble, I won't be bothering you." The woman replied, No, come to our house, you should come." And so, Reina went with them. They had lunch together, and Reina was very pleasant, chatting with them. Afterward, she left their home. The next day, she came back with a nice gift of flowers, and this continued for several days. Reina became good friends with the doctor. Even her husband was happy about it because they weren't from Damascus. They were from another province. His wife didn't have close friends nearby, so he was glad that she had found someone she could be comfortable with. He also liked that his wife had someone to keep her company while he worked. He would go to work, and his wife would tell him, "Go ahead, I'm spending time with Reina, I'm happy with her." Reina visited the doctor's house almost every day, holding the child, hugging him, and kissing him. This went on for about 2 or 3 weeks, until Hamid was released from prison. Reina welcomed him and went to their apartment. She was treating him with respect, asking, "Where did they take my son?" She couldn't believe they had brought her son to them. He replied, "I swear, I won't leave them. Your vile friend and her husband will pay." She asked him, "When do you want us to go?" He said, "Today," she replied. "No, not today, tomorrow. Tomorrow morning we'll go to their apartment, wait for her husband to leave for work, and then we'll confront your friend, who's keeping our son. We'll storm into the apartment and rescue our child from her hands." He agreed. Hamid doesn't know what that scoundrel is up to, but his son is filled with hatred. "Did you kidnap him? How do I take my son?" The next day, he was already standing by the building early in the morning, with Reina, of course. They waited until the engineer came out. Of course, she was eager to know who his friend was and who his wife was. The doctor and her husband, the engineer, were the ones who had kidnapped their son. When the engineer came out and went to work, she said, "Now, can we go get our son?" Then, "Is this the engineer? I want you to raise him like take my right from him? But right now, the most important thing is to get our son." He said, "Okay." When the engineer left, Reina and Hamid went upstairs to the building, knocked on the door. The doctor was surprised. "Good morning? Who's coming?" As soon as she opened the door, Reina attacked her, with Hamid alongside her. The doctor was shocked. "Why? Why, Reina? Why? What's going on?" They struck her and threw her to the ground. Reina ran into the bedroom and grabbed the child. When the doctor saw that the attack was to take her son, she lost her mind. She screamed, and Hamid turned to her, pulling out the knife. These types of knives that open up, he stabbed her in the neck. He told her, "You're vile? You want this thing? My wife is in prostitution? And you're taking my son?" He kept stabbing her until he killed her. Then, he took his wife and the child, whom he believed was his own. People from the building could hear the doctor's screams, and she was begging for help. Everyone gathered around the building entrance, wondering where the screams were coming from. They saw Hamid, covered in blood, and his wife carrying the child. Hamid, holding the knife, yelled, "Anyone who comes near me, I'll kill them. This is my son, and I took my son." He truly believed that he had saved his son. The building's guards and bystanders rushed to stop him, striking him with sticks and iron rods until he passed out. They called the police, and they arrested Hamid, Reina, and the child. When they arrived, they found the doctor dead, stabbed in the neck. The engineer was informed, and he lost his mind. He realized that his wife's murder was related to the girl he had met in the park. He was even more shocked. When the truth came out, even Hamid, the fool, was convinced that the child was his. Even in front of the police, he tried to justify his actions. He said, "I took my son. I planned this, and you're forcing my wife into prostitution." Reina remained silent, silent, silent. When the engineer came, he clarified to the police, "Yes, we met her in the park. This is my son and my wife. Here are our papers, and she just came from the hospital." When they asked Reina, "Where did you give birth? Where did you give birth?" She said, "No, everything Hamid is saying is nonsense. He doesn't even understand what's going on." They were trying to figure out what the story really was. They understood the story. She said, "I lied to him, and honestly, I was looking for any woman to kidnap her child. I didn't expect him to kill her. I thought we'd just take the child and run. And he thinks this is my son and I'll raise him and that's it. But I didn't imagine that he'd serve to kill her, and people gathered against us, and honestly, that's what happened." What's the story that caused such a shock? A real shock, I mean, for everyone who heard the story, from Reina's cunning, and Hamid's stupidity, and the naivety. Frankly, the doctor and her husband, that she's a strange woman, and suddenly you get to know her? Suddenly you bring her into your home? Suddenly, I mean, that's them. A person has to be confused, honestly. Right? Okay? Have compassion for people? But everything has its limits. Everything has its limits. Because you don't know this strange person who enters your life. You don't know who this is? What's the background? The criminal record that he committed. What do you need to study before I bring him into your home? I mean, not just anyone. And that's what happened. As for the long story, Hamid was sentenced to death, and Reina was sentenced to 15 years in prison, meaning she's the one who planned the whole mess and got 15. And this deceived one, his punishment is death? Just because he committed the crime, I mean. And the poor ones who had their heads broken, the doctor who left without any fault. And don't forget, may God bless you. Subscribe to the channel. And this is the end of our story. And peace be upon you. Goodbye.